Namaskar. In the last video lecture, I talked about RT-PCR, and the next thing that comes in mind is automatically the CT value, the cycle threshold value. So this term CT value has become suddenly popular because of the COVID-19. CT stands for cycle threshold value. What is this? When you are getting your RT-PCR report, you are getting this CT value written on that also. And everybody has known this term, CT value. So what does it actually say? The cycle threshold, it is basically the number of PCR cycles at which you get the first signal of the fluorescence, and that signal is above the background level. So till a certain cycle, number of PCR cycle, the fluorescence signal is low. It is below the background level. The double-stranded DNA are being formed. They are being accumulated in the reaction mix. But the amount of fluorescence that they emit is not above the background fluorescence that is already there in the reaction mix. The unbound fluorescence fluorophore molecules, they also emit a background fluorescence. So after a certain number of PCR cycle, the fluorescence suddenly is more than that background level. And that number of PCR cycle is the CT value of that sample. And it depends on the amount of starting material. I mean how much RNA or DNA you have taken or your sample contains when you start the PCR process. If it is more, then you quickly reach the CT value. And if it is less, then your CT value will be higher. So basically it is like this. Suppose, say this is an XY graph. The x-axis is the number of PCR cycles, and the y-axis is fluorescence. You are measuring the fluorescence. So there is a background level of fluorescence like this. You are getting a background emission of fluorescence. Okay, and your base level is, the background base level is, say, this one. So up to this you are getting a background fluorescence. So suddenly after, say, suppose this is 10 cycles, this is 20 cycles, this is 30 cycles, and this is 40 cycles or so. PCR is not run beyond 40 cycles because it means that the sample does not contain enough amount of RNA or DNA, so it is useless to run beyond 40 cycles. So suppose your sample suddenly shows a fluorescence boost at say 20 cycles. So you will get a fluorescence emission like this. So your CT value is what? Your CT value is this one, when it is more than this base level, this is the CT value. That means this 20 cycle, in this case, is the CT value of this sample. Suppose this sample is sample A. Now in another sample, say sample B, the sample B shows a little later, the CT value is more. The fluorescence beyond the background level is emitted little later, say here. So the CT value is 30 cycles or so. So in this case CT value is 30. In this case the CT value is 20. So this is sample B. So what does this mean? This means that the CT value more means your DNA at the initial stage, your RNA at the initial stage was very, very less. So it took so many cycles to amplify it. It was not enough, because of which it took longer cycles, more cycles to amplify the same amount of DNA which was produced in lesser number of cycles with sample A. That means sample A contains more amount of DNA or RNA. In case of COVID-19, it is RNA. Mostly it is done with respect to RNA because we want to understand the expression level of a certain gene, or in this case, you are tracing the disease, the coronavirus, the presence of the coronavirus or not. So the ICMR have decided that the CT value, if it increases, if you are getting a CT value of 35 and above, that means there is no coronavirus. The case is negative. The report is negative if the CT value is more than this 35. If you are getting a fluorescence after this 35 cycles, your report is negative. So what does this mean again? If CT value is 30 taken to be negative, that means very little amount of coronavirus, even if it enters, it may cause infection. I'm deriving some other information from here, that if this CT value, the threshold value, if they would have kept it 30 or 20, that means a good number of inoculum potential, I mean the number of coronavirus that you are getting from somewhere. How many coronavirus you are getting infected at the initial stage? That is important. Okay. And one thing more is important, how many of those coronaviruses are actually active viruses? Normally, out of 200 viruses, one virus is active. I'm not talking about coronavirus or COVID-19. In general, these flu viruses, out of 200, one is active. So, how many active coronaviruses should enter into your body so that the disease will develop? This is called inoculum potential. So, if this is high, 35, that means very less amount of, they are concerned, it is a matter of concern that even after 35 cycle you are saying that the case is negative. After 35 cycle, which is too much, that means very little amount of coronavirus intake is also dangerous. It may cause infection. Or if it is, in case of the other variants which were more contagious, I don't know whether ICMR have shifted the CT value to 36, 37 or 38. If they shift it, that will indicate that that particular virus is even more potent than the previous one. That means inoculum potential is less. It can cause disease even in less amount of its dose. So this is the concept of CT value. That means that CT value is inversely proportional to the viral load. Say if this is the this x-axis it indicates the viral load, how much viruses you are carrying, and this y-axis is CT value. So CT value, if at the initial stage of your disease, your viral load will be less. At higher, when the infection is in the middle stage, at the peak level, your viral load will be high. So if you proceed, if you measure your CT, if you do your RT-PCR and you see your CT value, you measure the CT value, then you will find that it is decreasing like this. Okay? And say if you are trying to see after you have recovered from the initial stage to the stage when the disease is at its peak level and then it is declining. Say this is the infection days on the x-axis and the y-axis is CT value. In that case, you will get a decline in the CT value because the infection dose is increasing. At the initial stage, at day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, the dose of the virus is less. This new variant has it had a incubation days, shorter incubation days, so the maximum stage will reach quite sooner. but the previous strain, it has 7 to 8 days of incubation period. So during that period, symptoms, the patient remain asymptomatic. So at that stage, if you measure the CT value of a patient, of a particular person, if you detect that person has been infected with coronavirus, the CT values will be quite high. So they will gradually decrease. That means the viral load is increasing. The CT value is decreasing, that means the viral load is increasing, and it will come to a minimum level when the viral load will be maximum, when the disease will be at its peak level. And then when it will remain at that level for quite some days, and maybe on the day 13, 14 or 15, it will start declining, and on the day 2021, it will reach to the previous stage, or you might not have any trace of virus in your body, so your CT value will be above 35, or it will not come even after 35 cycles. No amplification will occur. So this is how CT value is plotted not in an XY axis, rather it is a semi-logarithmic curve. You have to plot this CT value in a semi-logarithmic curve so that you can get a linear curve over here. And that indicates that you can back calculate that how much the starting material of RNA or DNA was there. From that, you reach to that level of amplification after that many PCR cycles. So that is what CT value is about. Thanks for watching.